Let's get more on the relationship between China and Africa. Isabel Hilton is the founder of the organization China Dialogue. Hello, Isabel. For 35 years, China's first foreign visit of the year has always been to Africa. Why is Africa so important to China?
Well, Africa represents a number of things. It's a huge economic opportunity for China. You know, the fastest growing economies in the world are now in Africa. But it's also a great block of influence. And China positions itself as, if you like, the leader of the emerging economies. So in terms of votes in the United Nations, for example, or diplomatic support for China's position, China has stated its intention of rebalancing the global system away from established liberal democracies and towards emerging economies. Africa clearly plays a big part in that, and hence China's very assiduous cultivation of African leaders and its building of economic relations with Africa, which go back many, many years.
How does the frequency of visits from China compare with visits from other global powers to Africa? Because let's face it, Africa is much sought after, thinking just purely for its minerals.
It is much sought after, but honestly, if you look at the Chinese record, so you mentioned that for 35 years the Chinese foreign minister has made Africa his first trip of the year. We're celebrating this year 25 years of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which means that every 3 years more than 80 African leaders go to Beijing, where they have talks, where they're celebrated, where, you know, they're given a lot of respect. And if you look at the frequency, or rather the infrequency of visits from, for example, American presidents, it's really startling. Very, very few visits from the United States at a very high level. And even in Europe, the old colonial powers, the frequency of visits is very, very much less than from China. So China has worked at this relationship.
What do you see for Africa-China relations in 2025, particularly given the rapidly changing geopolitical context?
Well, I think that there are, as you mentioned, some critical areas. So strategic minerals, lithium, for example, is very important. Energy is very important. I note that the visit to Nigeria and Chad, both of them are energy producers. And climate change is going to impact Africa very severely. So it would be a good thing. We have a big climate conference coming up in Brazil towards the end of the year, when all countries are expected to put their nationally determined contributions on the table. I think it would be very encouraging for Africa if China were to present an ambition to cut its emissions quite radically, because that's going to be necessary for African prosperity, for African survival. And I think also there are a number of bilateral issues, for example, the impact of Chinese imports on local industries in Nigeria, and the general question of the balance of trade. I think some African leaders would be keen to talk about that. But it's a very solid relationship, and I'm sure that the issues that exist within the bilateral relationships will be the subject of discussion.
Thank you so much. Isabel Hilton, the founder of the organization China Dialogue.